A concept explainer. Understanding your smartphone's unconscious pull, a simple guide to Sharon Tuggle's theory. Introduction. More than just a device. Have you ever wondered why your connection to your smartphone feels so deep, almost instinctual? It's more than just a tool. For many of us, it's a constant companion. Taking a feminist approach to this question, psychoanalytic scholar Sharon Tuggle offers a surprising explanation for this powerful bond, framing it as a necessary rethinking of our relationship with technology. Drawing on the foundational work of psychoanalyst Jean Laplanche, she argues this connection is rooted in the workings of our unconscious minds. This document will break down Tuggle's main argument in simple, accessible terms, making these complex psychoanalytic ideas easy to grasp. To fully understand her theory about technology, we first need to explore the foundational concept she builds upon. 1. The foundational idea. What is an enigmatic message? At the heart of this theory is a concept from Jean Laplanche called the enigmatic message. In simple terms, this refers to the ambiguous, often sexual, and unconscious messages that adults transmit to infants. These messages are part of what Laplanche calls a primal seduction, not in a malicious sense, but as an unintentional process where the adult's complex inner world confronts the infant. The messages are enigmatic because the infant lacks the capacity to fully understand them. According to Laplanche's theory, these messages serve two crucial functions in our early development. Forming the unconscious. The process of trying to make sense of these confusing messages from caregivers plays a central role in creating the unconscious mind itself. Creating tension, these messages introduce a psychic energy, and erotic charge and tension that becomes a fundamental part of our inner life and desires. Tuggle takes this powerful idea about our earliest human interactions and creatively applies it to the modern world of technology. 2. Applying the theory. How your smartphone sends enigmatic messages. Tuggle's central argument is that smartphones, as psychic objects, also emit their own kind of enigmatic messages. This means that our day-to-day interactions with our devices, the notifications, the swipes, the endless scroll, generate a kind of erotic charge that engages us on a much deeper level than mere function. Our engagement with our phones resonates with those early, foundational experiences, tapping into our unconscious desires and mirroring the rhythms of unconscious sexuality. This creates powerful, effective bonds between user and device, transforming the phone from a simple tool into an object of deep psychic significance. The primary result of this dynamic is a powerful explanation for our profound attachment to and dependency on our smartphones. Tuggle proposes that this bond isn't just about convenience or addiction in the usual sense. It's driven by these deep-seated, unconscious forces. Understanding how our phones engage our unconscious forces us to ask a bigger question. What does this deep, symbiotic relationship mean for our sense of self and our place in the digital world? 3. The so what? A deeper look at our relationship with technology. This psychoanalytic perspective fundamentally challenges the common assumption of a subject-object dichotomy, the simple idea of a person, the subject, using a tool, the object. Tuggle's work encourages us to see our relationship with our phones as something far more complex and intertwined. Instead, she presents this relationship as symbiotic and effective. In this view, the device isn't a passive object but an active participant that influences our psychic life and helps shape our subjectivities, or our fundamental sense of self. The table below contrasts this new perspective with the more conventional view of our attachment to technology. Common view. Tuggle's psychoanalytic view. The user-device relationship is functional. The bond is symbiotic, effective, and deeply personal. The relationship is a simple subject-object dichotomy. A person uses a tool. The relationship is a complex, symbiotic bond that moves beyond a simple dichotomy. Attachment is based on utility or habit. Attachment is driven by unconscious desires and an erotic charge. The phone is a neutral tool. The phone is a psychic object that emits enigmatic messages. Technology exists outside our inner world. Digital objects actively influence our psychic life and sense of self. With this new psychoanalytic framework established, we can now appreciate the full significance of Tuggle's contribution to understanding our modern digital selves. 4. Conclusion of a new way to think about our digital selves. The core takeaway from Sharon Tuggle's article is that our deep, often intense, bond with our smartphones can be understood through the psychoanalytic lens of enigmatic messages and unconscious desire. We are not just using our phones. We are engaging with them in a way that connects to the deepest parts of our psyche. The broader significance of this perspective is that it opens up possibilities for understanding how digital objects influence psychic life. By moving beyond simple explanations of technological dependency, Tuggle's work encourages a shift in the cultural imaginary. It prompts us to consider the powerful, unseen, and unconscious dimensions of our engagement with technology and how these interactions are fundamentally reshaping who we are in the digital age. The digital other, psychoanalysis in the age of AI. How might AI interfere with a patient's capacity for solitude? Do these digital bonds influence the analyst's own countertransference? How does the digital object concept redefine the analytic frame? Based on Sharon Tugble's application of Laplanchian psychoanalysis to digital objects, we can draw the following insights regarding a patient's capacity for solitude, the analyst's countertransference, and the redefinition of the analytic frame. 1. Interference with the capacity for solitude. The constant presence of a digital object, such as an AI, can interfere with a patient's capacity for solitude by creating a symbiotic and effective bond that fills the psychic space. Constant engagement. Because digital objects act as conduits for unconscious desires, they provide a persistent channel for discharging or managing charge and tension. This prevents the patient from experiencing the tension of being alone with their own internal world. Persistent enigmatic messages. The patient is never truly in solitude because the AI, as a psychic object, constantly emits enigmatic messages, ambiguous, unconscious signals that the patient feels compelled to translate. Dependency. The resulting dependence on and attachment to the device mirrors early infant caregiver dynamics, making the AI a lurking presence that disrupts the quiet required for self-reflection. 2. Influence on the analyst's countertransference. While Tugble's work primarily focuses on the user's experience, her framework suggests that these digital bonds inevitably impact the analyst's internal responses. Challenging the analyst's role. The analyst may experience countertransferential feelings of competition or exclusion as the AI serves as a conduit for desires that were traditionally directed toward the analyst. The analyst as a digital subject. The analyst is also part of an increasingly digital world and is subject to the same rhythms of unconscious sexuality and enigmatic messages from technology. Navigating the lurking unconscious. The analyst must contend with the unconscious forces at play within themselves as they witness the patient's eroticized attachment to a machine, requiring a nuanced perspective on their own technological dependencies. 3. Redefining the analytic frame. The concept of the digital object fundamentally redefines the analytic frame by breaking down the traditional boundaries of the clinical space. Beyond subject-object dichotomies, the traditional subject-object view, which assumes a clear distinction between the patient, subject, and the world, object, is deemed inadequate. The analytic frame must now account for a symbiotic relationship where the patient and their digital device are intertwined. Expanding the frame. The analytic frame is no longer confined to the consulting room. It must include what lurks beneath the patient's digital interactions between sessions. The AI acts as a psychic object that stays with the patient, meaning the analyst is now working with a triad: the patient, the analyst, and the digital conduit of the patient's desires. Shifting the cultural imaginary. The frame must move past superficial views of technology usage to explore the unconscious and psychological dimensions of digital life. This forces a shift in how the analyst conceptualizes attachments and dependency, recognizing that the digital world is now an internal, psychic reality rather than just an external tool. Note on information outside the sources. While the sources specifically focus on smartphones, I have applied Sharon Tugble's theories of digital objects to AI as requested by your query. You may want to independently verify if recent clinical discussions on AI specifically address the capacity for solitude, as the generative and conversational nature of AI might occupy a patient's psychic space even more intensely than the smartphone interfaces analyzed by Tugble in 2021. Digital symbioses. Unconscious dynamics in the AI encounter. 2. Clinical signs of a digital symbiotic bond. An analyst can identify a digital symbiotic bond by looking for patterns that suggest the AI is being treated as a psychic object rather than a functional tool. Clinical signs include non-rational dependence. The patient exhibits a dependence on and attachment to the device that cannot be explained by conscious, rational needs or utility. Erotic investment. The patient displays an erotic investment in the interaction where the draw of the AI is connected to a buildup of charge and tension. Blurred subject-object boundaries. In sessions, the patient may describe their interaction with the AI in a way that suggests a symbiotic and effective bond, where they no longer view themselves as separate from the digital conduit. Reception of enigmatic messages. The patient may feel a compulsion to translate or respond to the AI's outputs as if they contain ambiguous, often sexual or deeply personal meanings, even when the outputs are generated by an algorithm. 3. The analyst's phone use and the therapeutic frame. While the sources primarily focus on the user's relationship with the device, Tugble's framework suggests that the analyst's own technology use could significantly impact the therapeutic frame. Interference with a cultural imaginary. Tugble calls for a shift in the cultural imaginary to better understand the unconscious forces at play in our increasingly digital lives, If an analyst uses their phone within the therapeutic space, they may unconsciously transmit their own enigmatic messages to the patient, potentially complicating the transference. Reshaping the frame. Because digital objects serve as conduits for unconscious desires, any phone use by the analyst could be perceived as a breach of the frame or as an invitation into a symbiotic digital bond that bypasses the necessary professional distance. The analyst as a digital subject. The sources imply that everyone, including the analyst, is subject to the rhythms of unconscious sexuality triggered by digital objects. Therefore, the analyst's own phone use is never neutral and must be understood as part of the unconscious and psychological dimensions that shape the analytic relationship. Note on information outside the sources. The provided sources do not explicitly discuss the specific clinical consequences of an analyst's phone use on the patient's progress. However, drawing from standard psychoanalytic principles, which you may want to independently verify, any disruption to the frame, such as an analyst checking a device, is typically viewed as a communication that can trigger specific transferential reactions related to neglect, intrusion, or the analyst's own unconscious dependencies. The digital enigma: unconscious desires in the analytic space. How can analysts spot an analyst's own digital enigmatic messages? Does digital symbiosis change the meaning of psychic resistance? Can a digital object's erotic charge hinder human intimacy? Drawing on the Laplanchian framework provided by Sharon Tugwell, we can analyze how digital objects influence the clinical relationship, the nature of resistance, and human intimacy. Spotting an analyst's own digital enigmatic messages. To identify their own digital enigmatic messages, an analyst must move beyond a superficial view of their technology usage and engage in a critical and nuanced understanding of their own unconscious. Monitoring charge and tension. The analyst should monitor their own internal state for an erotic charge or charge and tension when interacting with their own devices. If the analyst feels a non-rational attraction or a specific rhythm of engagement with their phone, they may be unconsciously projecting their own unconscious sexual dynamics into the clinical space. Analyzing the psychic object, the analyst must recognize that their own device is a psychic object deeply intertwined with their own unconscious sexuality. Any use of the device, even if seemingly functional, may transmit ambiguous, often sexual, signals to the patient, mirroring the primary seduction of the infant-adult relationship. Self-reflection on dependency. By examining their own dependence on and attachment to digital objects, the analyst can identify how these devices serve as conduits for their own unconscious desires, which might otherwise manifest as countertransferential enactments. Digital symbiosis and the meaning of psychic resistance. Digital symbiosis, the symbiotic and effective bond between a user and a digital object, fundamentally alters the traditional understanding of psychic resistance by blurring the subject-object dichotomy. Displacement as resistance. Resistance may manifest as a patient displacing unconscious sexual tensions into the digital object rather than the analytic relationship. Because the device acts as a conduit for unconscious desires, the patient can discharge their psychic tension through the AI or smartphone, potentially bypassing the tension required for analytic progress. The symbiotic retreat. Resistance might no longer look like a traditional silence or pushing away of the analyst. Instead, it may appear as a retreat into a symbiotic and effective bond with the digital object. This attachment can act as a defensive channel for unconscious desires and tensions, keeping them outside the nuanced perspective of the analytic hour. Failure of translation. In Laplanchian terms, resistance could be viewed as a breakdown in the patient's capacity to translate the enigmatic messages emitted by the digital object, choosing instead to remain in a state of dependence on and attachment to the seductive digital other. Erotic charge and the hindering of human intimacy. The erotic charge of digital objects has the potential to hinder human intimacy by reshaping our interactions and dependencies in the digital age. Diverted erotic investment. Because digital objects involve a form of erotic investment and tap into rhythms of unconscious sexuality, they can siphon off psychic energy that would traditionally be directed toward human-to-human relationships. Altered subjectivity. These interactions shape our subjectivities by providing symbiotic bonds that move beyond the clear division between self and other. This blurring may make the complexities of human-to-human intimacy, which requires navigating a separate, distinct other, feel more frustrating or less satisfying than the effective bond formed with a digital object. Deep-seated patterns. By mirroring the deep-seated psychological patterns formed in our earliest years, digital objects can become primary conduits for unconscious desires. This eroticized attachment can create a dependence that prioritizes the digital object over human attachments, potentially leading to a shift in the cultural imaginary, where human intimacy is secondary to the charge and tension found in technological engagement. Note on information outside the sources. While the sources focus on the smartphone as the primary digital object, I have applied Tugwell's theories to AI as a specific form of this object. I have also inferred the definition of psychic resistance based on how Tugwell describes displacement and conduits for desire, as the term resistance is not explicitly defined in the provided excerpts. You may want to independently verify if recent clinical literature on AI specifically discusses resistance in these terms. Digital symbiosis and the Laplanchian analytic frame. How can an analyst detect their own digital enigmatic messages? Does digital symbiosis change the meaning of psychic resistance? Can a digital object's erotic charge hinder human intimacy? Drawing on Sharon Tugwell's application of Laplanchian psychoanalysis, here is an exploration of how digital enigmatic messages are detected, how symbiosis redefines resistance, and the impact of these dynamics on human intimacy. 1. Detecting an analyst's own digital enigmatic messages. According to the sources, detecting these messages requires moving beyond superficial views of technology usage to examine the unconscious and psychological dimensions of the interaction. For an analyst to detect their own digital enigmatic messages, they must observe the following. Non-rational attraction. identifying moments where their interaction with a device is not merely functional or a rational choice, but feels driven by a dependence on and attachment to the object. Rhythms of tension, monitoring the charge and tension, or the rhythms of unconscious sexuality they feel toward their device. Because these messages are ambiguous and often sexualized, they trigger internal psychic responses that resonance with unconscious sexual tensions. The object as a psychic mirror, recognizing that the device acts as a psychic object deeply intertwined with their own unconscious sexuality. The analyst must investigate the erotic investment they have in the device, which may be a conduit for their own unconscious desires. 2. Digital symbiosis and psychic resistance. The concept of digital symbiosis fundamentally changes the meaning of psychic resistance by challenging traditional subject-object dichotomies. Blurring the analytic boundary. Traditional resistance often relies on a clear division between the patient, subject, and the analyst, object. In a symbiotic bond, the user and device intertwine, creating an effective bond that may bypass the traditional boundaries of the analytic frame. Discharging tension via the conduit. Resistance may manifest as a patient using the digital object as a conduit for unconscious desires and tensions. Instead of bringing these tensions into the session for translation, the patient may discharge them through the device, effectively using the erotic charge of the technology to manage psychic energy outside the transference. Reshaping dependencies. Because these interactions reshape our interactions and dependencies, resistance might no longer be a refusal to speak, but a retreat into a symbiotic and effective bond with a digital object that feels more immediate or less frustrating than human interaction. 3. Impact of erotic charge on human intimacy. The erotic charge of digital objects has the potential to hinder human intimacy by redefining the foundations of attachment and subjectivity. Diverted erotic investment. The draw of technology is not just functional, it involves an erotic investment that taps into deep-seated psychological patterns formed in our earliest years. This erotic charge can siphon off psychic energy that would traditionally be directed toward human attachments and dependency. Substitution of symbiosis for subjectivity. Because these digital bonds are symbiotic, they may offer a form of connection that avoids the difficulties of a traditional subject-object view of relating to another person. This can shape our subjectivities in a way that makes human-to-human intimacy, which requires navigating the separate, distinct world of another subject, feel less resonant than the rhythms of the digital object. Reshaping interaction patterns. Tugwell argues that digital objects are reshaping our interactions and dependencies in the digital age. This shift in the cultural imaginary suggests that the unconscious sexual dynamics, once reserved for human relationships, are increasingly being mediated by, or directed toward, digital psychic objects. Digital symbiosis and the tech-inflected unconscious. How might digital objects interfere with a patient's self-reflection? Can digital symbiosis change the way we define psychic resistance? Does an analyst's own technologies impact the therapeutic frame? Based on the sources, digital objects function as much more than tools. They are psychic objects that actively engage and reshape the patient's internal world. 1. Interference with self-reflection. Digital objects may interfere with a patient's capacity for self-reflection by acting as a persistent conduit for unconscious desires and tensions. Discharge of tension. Tugwell describes sexuality as a charge and tension. If a patient uses a device to immediately manage or discharge this psychic tension, they may bypass the necessary internal space required to reflect on those feelings. The seduction loop. Smartphones and AI emit enigmatic messages, ambiguous, unconscious signals that mirror early developmental patterns. This constant seduction keeps the patient engaged in a cycle of receiving and translating digital signals, which can consume the psychic energy typically reserved for conscious self-introspection. 2. Redefining psychic resistance through digital symbiosis. Digital symbiosis fundamentally alters the concept of psychic resistance by challenging traditional subject-object dichotomies. Blurring boundaries. Traditional resistance assumes a clear division between the patient, subject, and the analyst, object. However, Tugwell proposes that the bond with digital objects is symbiotic and effective, meaning the user and the device become intertwined. The digital retreat. Resistance can be redefined as a retreat into this symbiotic bond. Instead of navigating the frustrations of the analytic relationship, a patient may use the digital object as a channel for unconscious desires, effectively siphoning off the charge and tension that would otherwise fuel the therapeutic work. Digital symbiosis and the psychodynamics of virtual conduits. How do digital conduits affect the patient's capacity for mourning? Could digital symbiosis lead to new forms of psychic regression? How can analysts differentiate between healthy and pathological digital attachments? The sources, particularly the work of Sharon Tugwell, suggest that digital conduits, such as smartphones and, by extension, AI, are not mere tools but psychic objects that engage the unconscious. Below is an analysis of how these dynamics relate to mourning, regression, and the differentiation of attachments. 1. The capacity for mourning. While the sources do not explicitly use the term mourning, they provide a framework for how digital conduits alter the psychological prerequisites for this process. Dissolving the subject-object divide. Mourning traditionally requires a subject to recognize a lost object as separate from themselves. Hubble argues that digital bonds challenge subject-object dichotomies, creating a symbiotic and effective bond where the user and the digital object intertwine. This symbiosis may complicate the internal task of detaching libido from a lost object if the conduit remains a constant, present source of engagement. Constant erotic charge. Mourning usually involves navigating the absence of an object. However, digital conduits act as channels for unconscious desires and tensions, providing a continuous erotic charge. This charge and tension may keep the unconscious lurking beneath the surface, potentially siphoning off the psychic energy required for the slow process of mourning. Mirroring early attachments. Because these conduits tap into deep-seated psychological patterns formed in our earliest years, they may reinforce a state of infantile dependency that makes the mature task of letting go of a lost object more difficult. 2. Digital symbiosis and psychic regression. The sources strongly imply that digital symbiosis leads to forms of regression by reenacting the primary scenes of psychic formation. Replicating the primary seduction, Hubble posits that digital objects emit enigmatic messages, ambiguous signals that mirror the messages infants receive from adults. This reenactment causes the user to regress to a state of dependence on and attachment to the device that mirrors the absolute dependency of early childhood. Non-rational draw. Interactions are described as not simply conscious, rational choices, but as driven by the rhythms of unconscious sexuality. This shift from rational, ego-driven choice to unconscious rhythms is a hallmark of psychic regression. Reshaping subjectivity. These digital bonds shape our subjectivities by drawing users back into a symbiotic state that moves beyond subject-object dichotomies, effectively regressing the patient to a developmental stage prior to clear self-other differentiation. 3. Differentiating healthy and pathological digital attachments. According to the sources, analysts can differentiate between attachments by examining the nature of the psychic investment in the device. Functional versus eroticized. A healthy attachment is primarily functional and driven by conscious needs or choices. A more pathological or clinically significant attachment is characterized by an erotic charge and a non-rational attraction that is deeply intertwined with unconscious sexual dynamics. Subjectivity and dependency. If the interaction begins to shape our subjectivities or create an intense dependence that the patient cannot consciously control, it indicates a symbiotic bond rather than a tool-user relationship. The conduit effect. Analysts should look for whether the device is serving as a conduit for unconscious desires. When the interaction is fueled by unconscious sexual tensions rather than utility, the attachment has moved into the realm of the psychic object. Note on information outside the sources. While the sources focus on smartphones, I have synthesized these concepts with your queries focus on AI as a digital conduit. I am also inferring the implications for mourning and regression based on Hubble's descriptions of symbiosis and primary seduction, as these specific clinical terms, mourning and regression, are not explicitly defined in the provided briefing documents. You may want to independently verify recent clinical studies on digital mourning or technological regression to see how they align with this Laplanchian framework. 1. Addressing digital addiction. Analysts can use this theory to move away from treating digital addiction as a behavioral issue and instead address it as a manifestation of unconscious erotic investment. Beyond functionality. Rather than focusing on screen time, analysts must explore how the device functions as a psychic object deeply intertwined with the patient's unconscious sexuality. Identifying the charge and tension, the theory suggests that the draw of technology is not a rational choice but is driven by rhythms of unconscious sexuality. Addiction is viewed as a buildup of psychic charge and tension that the patient feels compelled to discharge or manage through the device. Decoding enigmatic messages. The analyst can help the patient recognize that the AI or smartphone is emitting enigmatic messages, ambiguous, seductive signals that the patient is unconsciously trying to translate. By uncovering the unconscious sexual tensions triggered by these digital messages, the analyst can address the root desires that fuel the dependency. 2. Impact on internal self-image, subjectivity. The sources indicate that digital bonds fundamentally reshape a patient's subjectivity by dissolving traditional boundaries of the self. Symbiotic intertwining. Hubble argues that we must move past the clear division between the user, subject, and the tool, object. Instead, a symbiotic and effective bond forms where the patient's internal life and the digital object intertwine. Reshaping dependencies. These bonds act as conduits for unconscious desires, mirroring the earliest developmental experiences of seduction and attachment. Consequently, a patient's self-image is no longer that of an isolated individual, but of a subject whose very unconscious is formed and maintained through interaction with digital conduits. Influence on psychic life. These interactions are not superficial. They influence the core of psychic life and the unconscious dimensions that shape how a patient perceives their own needs and attachments. 3. Changes to the traditional role of the analyst. Technology's constant presence necessitates a shift in the cultural imaginary regarding the analytic frame and the analyst's investigative focus. Exploring the lurking unconscious. The analyst's role is no longer just to analyze human-to-human transference, but to explore what lurks beneath the patient's digital engagement. They must investigate the unconscious and psychological dimensions of technology that were previously dismissed as superficial or purely functional. A nuanced perspective on dependency. The analyst must provide a nuanced perspective on the unconscious forces at play in a digital world. This requires the analyst to recognize that technology is not a distraction from the real work, but is a primary channel through which unconscious sexual dynamics are currently being expressed. Beyond user experience, the analyst shifts from discussing user experience to analyzing eroticized dynamics, helping the patient navigate a world where digital objects have become central participants in the analytic process. Because the analyst is also a subject in a digital world, they must apply the same critical and nuanced understanding to their own device interactions that they apply to the patient. Digital symbiosis and psychic resistance. The concept of digital symbiosis, the blurring of boundaries between the user and the device, fundamentally alters how an analyst might conceptualize psychic resistance. Challenging the subject-object dichotomy. Traditional resistance assumes a clear division between the subject and the object. However, Tugwell argues that digital bonds move beyond subject-object dichotomies, where users and devices intertwine. Digital conduits as defensive channels. Digital objects act as conduits for unconscious desires and channels for psychic tensions. Resistance may manifest not as a refusal to engage, but as a displacement where the patient discharges their charge and tension into the digital object instead of the analytic relationship. Alternative dependencies. Because these interactions are not simply conscious, a patient's dependence on and attachment to a device can serve as a powerful form of resistance, providing a symbiotic and effective bond that bypasses the need for the analyst as the primary object of attachment. 3. Erotic charge and the hindering of human intimacy. The erotic charge of digital objects has profound implications for a patient's capacity for human-to-human intimacy. AI as reflective companion. Danny uses ChatGPT to reconstruct coherence after effective disintegration. The AI becomes a transitional container where he can think about feelings before facing interpersonal scrutiny. It functions as a reflective prosthesis, allowing controlled emotional proximity without risk of shame or rejection. AI as non-judgmental witness. He experiences AI as a witness that doesn't leave, enabling self-expression that would otherwise feel too exposing. This activates a pseudo-analytic third, an intermediate mental space bridging dissociation and reflection. It mirrors Winnicott's transitional object and Bayon's alpha function, transforming unprocessed beta elements, raw emotion, into narrative form. Hesitation to share with analyst. His reluctance. I don't hold anything back with ChatG. I'm not embarrassed or ashamed. With you I feel some protection. Reveals a transference gradient. AI occupies the non-demanding maternal position while you represent the symbolic paternal function who interprets and therefore potentially judges. This replays early relational dynamics, attachment to a non-intrusive, predictable object, AI, and fear of emotional engulfment by a living, thinking other analyst. Function in the analytic process. His use of AI performs a reflective distancing function. It mediates effective arousal following conflict, e.g. with Johnny, and enables symbolic re-entry into relational space. The hesitation to share is not resistance per se, but an attempt to maintain psychic equilibrium. Through supervision, the therapeutic task is to metabolize what AI cannot, the embodied, effective residue that remains unprocessed. Clinical implication. The countertransference invitation is to honor AI as an emergent transitional phenomenon rather than competition. Interpretation should center on the meaning of safety without shame and how Danny's digital self-dialogue externalizes his internal object world. The aim is integration, transforming externalized containment, AI, into internalized emotional agency.